Hi everyone, and welcome to the second episode of the Albums Only podcast. My name is Alan Beavers. Alongside me, as always, is Jacob Slater. And this week, for the second episode of the Albums Only podcast, we're going to be talking about Miles Davis's Bitches Brew, the 1970 album that is a nice fusion of rock and jazz. Jacob, anything else that you wanted to talk about or any thoughts that you had before we get underway here?
I chose this album, and obviously me and Beebs worked together on choosing which albums we decide to record or to talk about on the podcast. I chose this album. It's the one that I had the most input on, mainly because, if I'm going to be listening to music and I'm going to be trying to discuss music on like a critical level, I thought that I wanted to get kind of a broad perspective. I wanted to kind of dig into a whole bunch of different genres of music, get into a different kind of mindset than what I might have been previously, which I considered myself a very kind of diverse listener, but I don't know if I would consider myself someone who considers music beyond short spectrum, kind of like a spectrum that I'm familiar with, that has lyrics that I can discuss. So I kind of wanted to not only do that, I also kind of wanted to show that we here at the Albums Only podcast are not going to be kind of pigeonholing ourselves into a specific genre of music, certain artists, just because we may not be like classically trained, we may not understand musical terms and such. It's a learning experience for me as well as hopefully for the audience as well. So I decided, what's a genre of music that I don't really understand all that well, although I enjoy? Jazz. Well, who's an artist that I have listened to and I respect a lot? Well, Miles Davis. So I think kind of lends itself to this podcast that I pick one of the most famous albums by one of the most famous jazz musicians, Bitches Brew, which is an incredibly interesting name for an album. Bitches Brew sounds like an album you'd hear from the Rolling Stones.
That is so funny. That was a great introduction, by the way, Jacob. Thank you for pointing that out. That needs to be said. We are not professionals. We don't. I don't have a big education in music, other than loving it and listening to it. Much like you, Jacob. We don't know the ins and the outs of these things. I'm sure there are people who may listen to this who are going to know way more than we do, and that's cool. That's great. But it's also, this podcast is also about letting people know that, hey, you should check this out. And you can know as little as we do and enjoy it. You know what I mean? Like, that's really what this podcast is about. So I think that's a great introduction. I think it's a great point, too, to mention that it's not going to be just rock and roll. Now, we've also chose jazz here in this instance, and there are other jazz albums which I like also quite a lot. But I want to get that out of the way first. I think that's great. I'm very happy that you said that, buddy. That's a great point. You're right. We don't know everything, and there are people who are going to hear this and they're going to go, well, actually, on the third song in the fourth album, the saxophonist was the cousin's uncle's brother. I get that. Like, that's cool, and people are more than welcome to have their criticisms and to share their insights, and we love that. We love learning as much as possible, but I think it's really important to note that we're just average Joes who really love music and who like talking about it and are just basically making that public. So that's the first point. So thank you for saying that. And then I think the second thing is, I swear to you, you said that Bitches Brew sounds like a Rolling Stones album, but I listened to Bitches Brew twice, and I really got the feeling of the Rolling Stones to me. This sounded like a jazz-infused Rolling Stones record. It's so funny that you mentioned that. I know you're talking about the name, but the very first thing I thought of was the Rolling Stones. So that's so very interesting. So I'm sorry. Go ahead. Please go on.
Yeah, I think the main question I'm going to be focusing on the discussion of this album is, this is considered a kind of jazz rock, a fusion album. I wanted to kind of discuss what makes this album a fusion album, and kind of like what goes into this album that kind of like implies that it's fusion and everything. I'm also going to obviously talk about the music and the historical context, but that's kind of like, because obviously, I'll just get into it right now. I'm going to set the stage, if you will, for this album. The year is 1970. The Beatles have released Let It Be. Turns out to be the last album that they would release. One of the biggest bands of all time is broken up. David Bowie, the focus of our very first episode on here, has released The Man Who Sold the World, a hard rock album that would kind of lead up into Hunky Dory and his eventual success. Music has gone from Elvis Presley and Frank Sinatra. Pop music has expanded from this into a vastly different beast than it was only a few years prior. 1966, obviously, you had Rubber Soul, I believe, by the Beatles, released that year. You had Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys. Pop music has reinvented itself. It has become synonymous with rock music, and rock music has expanded to encompass a wide range of cultural styles, of like music experimentation, of lyrical experimentation, recording experimentation. Now enter Miles Davis. By the year 1970, Miles Davis is already one of the most prolific jazz musicians of all time. He has worked with some of the other greatest jazz musicians of all time, Herbie Hancock, John Coltrane, Wayne Shorter. Just 1 year previous, he has released In a Silent Way, which is considered his first fusion album. But jazz music, well, it has progressed in very different ways. From kind of the bebop style that Miles Davis pioneered back in the 50s to the experimental free jazz popularized by Ornette Coleman in the late 50s, early 60s. So Miles Davis, being one of the great jazz players, he looks at popular music. He sees that rock music has kind of expanded. And so I think he says to himself, well, jazz needs to reinvent itself in a bit to remain relevant, to kind of take a place in the public consciousness, because we already see on the rock side of things that this is the case, that there are artists who are accompanying jazz or jazz ideas into their music. Santana comes to mind. They have released Abraxas this year, their second album. So I think Miles Davis, in creating Bitches Brew, has decided to take a step into this new direction that he is already touched upon in a silent way, and decided to not just take a step, but leap into this kind of new musical scene that's being created in front of him. I think that's where we get Bitches Brew, which just from the cover you can tell that Miles Davis is embracing psychedelic music, he's embracing rock and roll music, but he's interpreting it through jazz as opposed to rock musicians interpreting jazz through rock music.
That's a great introduction. I think that's a great lens through which to view this. And that's, generally the accepted narrative. I think the interesting thing about Miles Davis is he's so prolific. He is the figure of jazz music. There's especially in the popular and modern context. It's interesting to note when you look at his discography, the very first release starts back in 1951, arguably, and then you come forward. You're coming forward, and he's putting out 2, 3, 4 albums a year. It's just amazing. And you really, the ones that people talk about. You've got in 1957 alone, he put out Roundabout Midnight, Miles Ahead, and Birth of the Cool. The man, it's amazing. And then 1959 is Kind of Blue. And 1960 is Sketches of Spain, which is just wonderful. And we're talking 10 years later. And, after 10 years, no matter who you are, you're that popular, you're that successful, you might tend to rest on your laurels. And, he's out there saying, no, I have to keep innovating. I have to keep drawing people in. I have to appeal to new people. It's amazing.
And it really kind of speaks to him as an artist, I think, that he can be so prolific in his album output and also continually strive creatively, I think, to reinvent himself.
What's your thought? I'm just, just thinking out loud here. What is your favorite kind of Miles Davis? Because you've got a lot. You've got you got a bopper. You've got You've got the rock fusion. You've got sort of the cool jazz style. I mean, do you have a personal favorite, or I mean, where's your mind when it comes to that sort of all the different variations of Miles Davis?
Personally, before I listened to Bitches Brew, I think the album that I loved the most by Miles Davis was Kind of Blue. And I think that's kind of personally, when I think of jazz, I have like two different opinions of what like jazz is to me. And one is like the smoky, nightclub.
Right.
You're gonna see Sam Spade like walking down the door,
Right.
like, and then like the explosive, experimental kind of jazz. I don't really go for much more jazz. Like it has to be like either very cool or it's got to be very explosive and expressive, in my opinion. I think Kind of Blue was like, in terms of Miles Davis, was like the peak for me of that style of jazz.
Right. If I could, and I've run into the sort of person who will say, the sort of people who like jazz or love jazz, and they'll say, I'm interested in what you have to say as long as you don't say your favorite album is Kind of Blue, because there's just sort of this thought that's what newbies listen to when it comes to jazz, and they don't understand, and that's all that they know, so they're only going to say what they know. But the reason that Kind of Blue is the introduction album, the introduction to jazz, in my Music 101 class that I had in college, the reason that it's the introduction is because it's so damned good, and it's so easy to listen to and to enjoy. And I don't know if rock and roll has that sort of album. I mean, can you name maybe a Beatles album, maybe like the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds, as you had mentioned previously? There's really not one. But you can point to Kind of Blue and jazz and say, this is jazz. This is a kind of jazz. And it'll get people interested. I think it gets people interested. So I really hate the stigma that Kind of Blue has, which is, it's a great album, but it's only for newbies. It's only for people who don't care. It's only for people who are only vaguely interested in what jazz could possibly ever be. Well, that might be true, but don't sleep on that album. It's still so wonderful. It has so many good songs that you know and you've heard previously. It has Blue and Green with Miles Davis and Bill Evans, which is just beautiful. I mean, gorgeous. So I just want to get that out of the way. Kind of Blue gets crapped on quite a bit now because everyone thinks that's what only newbies listen to, and it's not important anymore, or it's just sort of blah. And I can't disagree more.
I mean, I think we kind of see that in a lot of big music fans. I think we kind of like see that a lot, where there's like this kind of dismissive behavior towards people getting into music as opposed to the people who are already fans of music. There's this kind of barrier that we put up on ourselves to say, we are better than you.
Right.
For this reason, and this is because, and I mean, if you started Kind of Blue and then like stop, then it's like I could kind of understand that, because it's kind of like the mindset of, well, I'll listen to Johnny Cash, but I hate country music.
Right, right.
I'll listen to Eminem, but I hate rap music. There is a certain kind of mindset where I am interested in jazz music, but I don't want to appear interested, and so I kind of am dismissive of it, but I'll still kind of keep this off to the side. Like I'll give this a pass, and then I will still kind of dismiss it as a genre. And there are people who will dismiss those who are actually, entry level fans who do want to get more interested and just start on this album.
It's just worth mentioning here. I mean, there are so many Miles Davis albums you can point to as great albums. It's almost pointless for me to list them, but due to my nature, I'm going to list them anyway. You have stuff like, I mentioned Roundabout Midnight. I'm miles ahead. You've got Birth of the Cool. You've got Kind of Blue. You've got Porgy and Bess. You've got Sketches of Spain, which is a personal favorite. You've got Funny Valentine. You've got Miles Smiles. You've got Sorcerer. You've got Nefertiti. You've got Miles in Tokyo in a silent way, which you had mentioned previously is sort of the first fusion album. You've got Bitches Brew. You've got On the Corner. You've got a tribute to Jack Johnson. I could go on and on here, but my point is he's so prolific and has so many good works. You could pick anything and talk about it and say it's seminal or important, and you'd have a point.
It's very similar to David Bowie in the sense that there's distinct eras of Miles Davis that you can go into.
That's true as well. That's a good point, yes.
I mean, and I think that's also kind of the reason that we chose Miles Davis as like the second person to talk about, because they're both people known for reinventing their sound and doing it successfully. Because I think that's also an important point, that you can try to reinvent yourself, but unless you have the wherewithal to stick with it or kind of own up to it, I think is also very important. Let's start talking about the album itself. First track, Pharaoh's Dance. And there's a difference between rock fans and jazz fans when like the first track is 20 minutes long. You're like, yeah, that seems about right. 20-minute opening track. You compare it to Black Star, I mean, that was around 10 minutes long. And even that kind of seemed like, this is a really long song. I think maybe it could be a little shorter. Jazz, 20 minutes is short in jazz terms. But
it certainly can be, that's for sure. I agree with you 100%.
Pharaoh's Dance, really like the drums on this track. I like the drums like along the album. I think this is a very good track to kind of, maybe like more so than Black Star was in the first episode. I think it's a very good track that kind of sets up what to expect in the rest of the album. Because you got drums, you got like nice kind of smoky, heavy on the distortion. Well, not super heavy, but very kind of distinctly electric guitar that kind of builds up the sound into like this dissonance.
Yeah, there's a cacophony that builds, and that's true of a decent amount of tracks here. But you're right; it's specifically pronounced here.
When I was listening to this album, I thought, what makes this album a fusion album? And I think it starts off the question. I think it's really kind of what sets Bitches Brew apart from normal jazz. I think might be this kind of emphasis on simple rhythms. Because when you listen to Pharaoh's Dance, you got the drums going on, you got the guitar going on, but aside from maybe like the trumpet or something, you don't really see a lot of variation in like the drums. Like there's no drum solos. It's like, it's very kind of basic. Like it keeps the beat, like kind of like...
Right. I think that's a great point, is there's less freestyle or none given the track, but there's less freestyle on the drums. There's a real emphasis between sort of the guitar and the drum interplay, and then everything else sort of stems from that. And sort of like the trumpet, Miles gets, does his thing, and sort of like these extended jams with other instruments, but those are steady. I agree with you. I think that's sort of what the base is around there.
I think you really kind of get a sense for really what fusion is. You got this emphasis on rhythm. You got like the instrumentation is distinctly dissimilar from something like Kind of Blue. You got the heavy drums, you got the electric guitar and everything. You got keyboard going on. It is doing jazz through rock instruments is another point. And like the kind of the tone of the songs, I think, is also much heavier. I know that there's references to psychedelic on the Wikipedia page for this album, and I think that's also kind of, it's not Electric Ladyland, but there's also a very familiar tone with, the sounds of Pharaoh's Dance and something you'd hear on a Hendrix album.
Well, and Pharaoh's Dance, I have to tell you, I kept, and maybe it's because of the first track on the album, but I kept hearing Pharaoh's Dance, and maybe, this is my own bias towards what I know, obviously, but I kept hearing sort of like the Rolling Stones, Sympathy for the Devil, and Give Me Shelter. Like, I don't know if it's the guitars, the actual brand of the guitar, or the sound and sort of the interplay between sort of the guitars and the drums. I kept hearing those two songs in my mind. Like I would just sort of like they would just sort of enter there and this sort of branch out, and I would branch out into sort of Rolling Stones land. I don't know, how valid that thought is, but
Yeah, I can definitely see that though. But so Pharaoh's Dance fades out, and we go into the title track, which, if you thought Pharaoh's Dance was long, Bitches Brew clocks into almost a half hour. And I think that's also kind of a difference between jazz, the idea of jazz and the idea of rock, is that rock, at least prior to the 70s when you started seeing progressive stuff, rock is very much kind of bite-size. It's very much, like put the radio on, listen to some rock music with your friends and everything. Jazz music is like sitting down in a chair, get the pipe going. It's very kind of like sitting and thinking kind of music, as opposed to rock music. Rock music, which was, obviously when connected to pop music, very kind of consumable.
I don't think it's a disservice to call, particularly too, especially with cool jazz. I don't think it's a disservice to say that can even be background music and you can enjoy it. You can both actively listen to it and sort of be in the moment with it, or you can, something like that, and even to an extent, I think, jazz rock fusion, you can sort of play it in the background and sort of weave in and out of experiencing it. It works really well. You're sort of when you're out of it, you can get back into it quite easy. It just sort of works well in that way. Maybe it's the fact that there aren't lyrics, but it sort of has that feel to me. I mean, I don't know your thoughts on that, but I think it's great for both active and passive listening.
I mean, obviously there has been popular jazz. I think it's not necessarily a strict divide, but I definitely think like that. I think there's like a greater emphasis on like there's a greater emphasis on this kind of sitting and like taking in jazz music rather than kind of the active consuming that goes on with rock music. So Bitches Brew, the title track, starts with a nice little bit of bass, and they kind of this gets repeated later on in the album. This kind of, I believe it's a trumpet. I believe Miles Davis is like this trumpet blast that kind of gets repeated in this album. It sounds like it's like a trumpet blast rocketing off into space. That's how I always think about it. It's like this kind of hear this thing. It's also throughout the song it's very much passivity into explosivity, I think, is kind of the focus of this song. You got sitting and waiting, and then like the drums will ramp up, and then suddenly it's just bam, just explosion of sound, fade back down, ramp up, explode again.
Right, to play with dynamics. I mean, we see that too in rock music, right? I mean, you think of bands. I mean, it's one of my favorite bands, but I think of like a band like the Pixies. You think of that like quiet, loud, quiet kind of dynamic, and how well that works. So it's I think that it can certainly work, and it does work well here as well.
Yeah, and I think I was actually going to bring that up because I think that's also part of rock through jazz eyes that Miles Davis is exploring. This kind of idea of like quiet leading into the chorus almost. But actually put that down as one of my favorite songs on the record. Track number 3, Spanish Key, which obviously there is a Spanish influence on there, which reminds me a lot, obviously, of Santana. I really like Santana's early albums. I think Miles Davis kind of does a good job of like exploring kind of Spanish influences through this jazz rock, which and I also have that down as one of my favorite records on that album. Let's see, track number 4, John McLaughlin, which is also the shortest track on the album, runs in at around 4 minutes and 30 seconds.
I mean, I think the other big one here, I mean, which is right after John McLaughlin, is Miles Runs the Voodoo Down. That's great. I mean, I really enjoyed that. I just found that to be it really catches the attention after Spanish Key and John McLaughlin, Miles runs the voodoo down is just sort of supremely enjoyable.
McLaughlin is a very kind of heavy song. Well, maybe not too heavy, but there's definitely some piano and guitar kind of like trading back and forth. You got the drums going on. There's a little bit of sax under there. And then Miles runs the voodoo down. It's a very smoky song. I got hints of Hendrix going on. And it was appropriate because Jimi Hendrix also wrote Voodoo Child and everything. And 1970 was also the release of Band of Gypsies, which was Jimi Hendrix's last album, by the way. And a very smoky song. You got the trumpet reappearing as like the focus after fading in away from John McLaughlin. Got the sax going on, which all builds up again into this kind of explosive climax, as we've mentioned before. Kind of this idea of, which I believe is from rock music, is this idea of like just explosions of sound. Because when you think of jazz, you don't really think of this heaviness, this kind of sharpness of sound.
Even like bebop, right? I mean, that's more about the endurance, and it's fairly constant, right? Bebop, now you'll hear instruments swap in and out, but it's fairly upbeat the whole way through. So you're not getting sort of the dynamics going, I think would be the thing, right?
I mean, I think this is also kind of part of the idea is that Miles is making jazz into this kind of heavy music. He's taken it into a direction that I guess this idea, which was kind of growing in popularity at the time, of this kind of expansion of sound and ideas. You got rock music that's getting heavier, with like Black Sabbath starting up around this time. You got rock music that is expanding musically with like groups like Jethro Tull, Santana, and Emerson, Lake and Palmer, all this progressive rock. And so I think Miles Davis is expanding jazz by like making it into a heavier sound, this darker sound, like connecting it with this new form of music. So obviously, there's jazz has never been just a quiet form of music, but I think in this way that Miles Davis is intentionally pushing jazz into heavier territories. So after Miles runs the voodoo down, we have Sanctuary, which starts off very quietly. I believe trumpets going on. You got the trumpet and piano going on, with the band kind of slowly falling in. And then right around the 4-minute mark, you start getting into that kind of ramping up explosive territory that eventually just kind of fades down and fades back in again. So much like Bitches Brew, Sanctuary is very much, I think, a song about capturing this rock idea of loud, quiet, loud. The kind of verse into chorus mentality. And then let's see, last track of the album, Feo, very spacey song, I think.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this one too. I think Feo is really, I mean, that was the other one that stuck out in my mind here. I mean, Pharaoh's Dance, Bitches Brew, Miles Runs the Voodoo Down, and Feo, it's a really good closer. It just feels different enough to me to feel really good on this album.
Yeah, like guitar is heavy on the reverb, which is, I think, also kind of the influence of rock music on there. Obviously, you have Jimi Hendrix and other kind of musicians who really kind of focus on distortion and reverberation at this point in time. So Miles Davis obviously being inspired by that through this song. You also hear the return of that trumpet blast in space, I believe, that you heard way back in the early part of the album. And, again, you see this slow building into fast, but I don't think it ever gets quite as explosive as earlier tracks on the album. It's really kind of relaxing in a lot of ways, really chill. You can kind of it's a very nice way to end the album.
Yeah, I would agree.
I don't know. I think as someone who doesn't listen to jazz that often, I'm not unfamiliar with it, and I did work the jazz hour back when we did U92 together. I think while it can be daunting at first, if you're unfamiliar with jazz and you're listening to this album for the first time, I think the length of the tracks can be a bit daunting. You see a song that's like 26 minutes long, you're like, oh, do I really have the time to sit down and listen to this? But I think, as a whole, it's a very interesting album. I think it's, rather than kind of a specific performance, I don't think Miles Davis's best trumpet work is on this record. I think it's more, the appeal of this album is the tone it sets.
Right. And the precedent too, right? I mean,
yeah, like this kind of smokiness, this haziness in the sound, loud, this volume, I guess I could say, of Miles Davis interpreting psychedelic rock through eyes of a jazz musician. I think it's less an album you listen to for a specific song, and rather an album you put on to feel a certain way.
Right, it's an experience.
To kind of set a certain tone. Again, I believe it's like looking at the album cover, which is a very psychedelic album. It's very much outdoorsy. It's very much like sun and sky and everything. I think that's kind of what Bitches Brew is. It's like it's an outside summer album that you would put on in a hazy afternoon. You got like a cold drink in your hand. You just put on this album. You just like sit in your own juices in some ways. It's a very humid album.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And considering we're recording this on June 4th, and it's a nice warm day where you are and where I am, and it's a nice sunny afternoon. That's really fitting. You know what I mean?
And I think that's it's of its time as well. It's an album that speaks to the time of when it was created. When you look at Bitches Brew in context of what was going on, it fits in amazingly. And I think it's an album that really kind of not only speaks to the music that was going on, it was speaking to a new kind of social consciousness. This distinctly psychedelic, surreal album cover. The name of the album itself, Bitches Brew, not even the Rolling Stones had an album with Bitch on the title. They had a song called Bitch, but you wouldn't see the Rolling Stones naming an album. It's very much a statement, I think, like musically and culturally. And obviously there's, you see this African couple here. I think it's kind of, if you look at it all together, it is very much a statement of like music and culture and like this rising kind of African American consciousness that was going on. There's just more of this focus on non-American cultures, this interest in kind of expanding ideas and perceptions. It's a very interesting album. And while I wouldn't say that it replaces Kind of Blue in terms of like albums I like, I think this is an album that like I would want to revisit. It's an album that I'd kind of want to put on when the time is right. It's not something I need to really focus on. It's just an album that I need to enhance and experience.
Right. Well, I think that's probably a good place to leave it. Is there anything else that you wanted to say there about Miles Davis or about the music or anything else?
Miles Davis, obviously a phenomenal musician. I don't know if we're going to continue to keep up this kind of high grade of musicianship on the Album Only podcast. We might just end up doing a Asher Roth album next.
Right. After about album 700 or 800, we'll be down to, the riff-raffs and who knows what else by then. But the thing is, we've got a lot that we can cover, and we'll probably only, if I had to guess, we'll probably only end up doing one album per individual for a while, because again, we talk about other albums, other artists the artists themselves and the other artists' albums as a sort of a primer to doing this. So yeah, but you're right. We've got quite a ways to go until we need to worry about looking at another Miles album.
And listeners out there, don't let me stumbling over my words and trying to describe these songs as kind of an impediment to trying out this album. But if you are interested in jazz music, or even if you're not, even if you're kind of into the Genesis, or if you've listened to Sam's first couple albums, and you're kind of interested in seeing something that's kind of in a different context and kind of a reinvention of that, then check it out. And maybe you'll be better at kind of expressing your thoughts than I am.
That's a solid point to make. I just want to say, you're starting to break up a little bit on my end here, Jacob, so I don't know how much of that was clear to the listeners. But yeah, check it out. I mean, when we're stumbling over our words here, if we do that, if we don't do the album justice, check it out. That's the whole point, right? We want you guys to hear some different opinions, to learn about these types of albums. And the other thing, form your own opinion. So you know what? I actually disagree with you about this song or this thought. And be constructive and share that. I think that's awesome too. If you're interested in sharing your opinions or your thoughts or what we can do to make a better podcast, or the things that we've screwed up on, and you have constructive criticism, you can email us at albumsonlypodcast@gmail.com. That's albumsonlypodcast@gmail.com. And we'll do our best to potentially get back with you or take your criticism to heart, maybe too much to heart, and make rash and irresponsible changes off the fly. So no, we won't do that. But please email us with your support or your criticisms. We look forward to that. Jacob, thanks for joining me once again. And next week we will be back with Prince. This is one that Jacob really wanted to do. Prince's "Dirty Mind," and I have to say this really swayed me over. I really enjoyed this album quite a bit. So, any final thoughts, Jacob?
Just that I'm really looking forward to talking about "Dirty Mind."
As we all are. We'll see you next time on the Albums Only podcast.